they will be watching Russia's long-range strike programs, as well as Ukraine's long-range strike programs into Russia, for what's made them work, what has hindered those kind of operations, because that will inevitably be an early part of any campaign against Taiwan, or indeed any of the rest of us in the Pacific. They will have watched and learned from the quality of military forces on both sides, particularly the declining quality of the Russians, and will try and address that in their own military forces.
What effect do you think Trump's threats to impose tariffs and sanctions will have on China, both materially but also politically, in its relationships with the US and Russia?
Yeah, I think this is the most fascinating dimension of these threatened tariffs or secondary sanctions, sorry. The tariffs on Russia don't mean anything. There's only $3 billion in trade at the moment, so that's not going to change Russia's behaviour. China is the major economic enabler and provider of dual-use material to Russia at the moment. So secondary sanctions on them, which the Americans and everyone else has shied away from up until now, could be a really significant consideration for Xi. However, the real question I think we need to answer is this: does Trump have more will to impose these sanctions on China than Xi has to help Russia not lose the war? At the moment, I think Xi will see it as more important to keep Russia in the war than to roll over to the Americans, but you just never know how things may pan out.
And you also write in a recent Substack that China has been looking at how it can benefit from the prolonged war, and you analyse that quite in depth. Strategically, what does it gain?
Well, it gains a whole lot of things actually by the prolonging of the war. Unfortunately, it increases the suffering of the Ukrainian people. But what it does, it keeps Europe in Europe. Particularly with the current Trump administration's policy, with the Europeans leading on the war. But it does anchor the Americans still a little bit in Europe for some time, so it can't totally focus on China's aggression and coercion and everything else it's doing in the Pacific. Clearly, the trade relationship and what makes from this war has increased since 2022. It's got a source of much cheaper energy than it might have had otherwise from Russia. And at the end of the day, it's turning Russia into a country that depends on it. I don't think it turns Russia into a client state. I don't believe it goes that far. But it is certainly turning Russia into a state that is more dependent on China than it's ever been before. And that's all to China's advantage.
How much use does China see in the war as being a test bed, though, also for any future conflict in the Pacific?
Yeah, it's clearly observing the war very closely. The Chinese have a very long history of observing and learning from other people's wars. They looked at the Falklands War very closely. And if you have a look at it, a long-distance expeditionary operation to take back an island, that's exactly what the Americans might have to do for Taiwan. They studied the Gulf Wars very closely, the aerial campaigns over the former Yugoslavia, and more recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, not just for the technologies of war, but how Western military organizations function as systems, how they command and control. And since 2022, the Chinese have been watching this war, not just how drones and other things impact warfare, but how NATO, how the US administration makes decisions about these kind of conflicts to inform how China might make decisions in a future conflict over Taiwan.
And what do you think they have actually learnt from this?
Well, I think they've learned quite a few lessons. They've learned about nuclear saber rattling and the threshold for NATO and Western action when that kind of saber rattling occurs. They've clearly learned a lot about new technologies and the very, very profound impact of uncrewed systems in the air, on the land and at sea. I think they've learned a lot about deterrence and the theories of deterrence in the modern world. And I think another big lesson, and I'll wrap up with this one because there's lots of others, but I think they've learned a lot about misinformation and the strategic influence of Western populations. I mean, there's a great old movie, The Usual Suspects, and there's a quote in there that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to convince us he didn't exist. That's exactly what China's doing to Western populations, to try and convince us all it is not a threat.
Do you see any evidence at the moment that China is actually trying to probe NATO allies to see how they might react to China put into the scenario that it sees in Ukraine, if it were to have to come into some kind of potential conflict situation? Do you see it actually pushing the boundaries that we've seen sometimes with Putin's Russia doing with Europe and NATO allies?
Well, certainly China uses diplomacy very actively to try and shape perceptions and collect information on Western decision making. I mean, we see this continuously in Australia. The Chinese at the moment are working very hard to split Australia from its closest ally, the United States. I mean, they're just doing so much diplomatically and in the information space and economically to do that. And they want to try and do the same between Europe and America. It's in their interests to deal with individual countries, not large, powerful, rich alliances like NATO, or alliances like the Australia-Japan-US relationship in the Pacific. So this is something they're doing constantly, but they don't just work on diplomats or government people. They work on populations to try and have them convince politicians that they shouldn't be focusing on China.
And militarily, what ideas or concepts do you think China is interested in using in any potential attempt to invade Taiwan that it's looking at in Ukraine?
Well, I think there's a few. Clearly, they would like to ensure there's no Taiwanese version of Zelensky. I mean, the profound impact of Zelensky's leadership, particularly in the first days and weeks of the war, in unifying people and really energizing NATO and other Western countries into assisting Ukraine. The Chinese will have a very robust plan to decapitate Taiwanese leadership to prevent that happening, as well as break down the cohesion of Taiwan's defence. I think they will be watching Russia's long-range strike programs, as well as Ukraine's long-range strike programs into Russia, for what's made them work, what has hindered those kind of operations, because that will inevitably be an early part of any campaign against Taiwan, or indeed any of the rest of us in the Pacific. They will have watched and learned from the quality of military forces on both sides, particularly the declining quality of the Russians, and will try and address that in their own military forces. And then obviously the impact of autonomous systems. The US Indo-PACOM has the concept called Hellscape, which is essentially the Ukrainian drone line across the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese will be looking at, well, how do they penetrate that? But secondly, how might they set up their own drone line on the eastern side of Taiwan to prevent assistance to Taiwan in a contingency?
It's all very fascinating stuff. And if you were to make a direct comparison with the early 2000s, when China seized the opportunity to modernize its military and expand in the South China Sea while the US was preoccupied with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, how is it progressing now?
Well, I think the high point of that US distraction is over. Clearly, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are over. The Trump administration is shifting its attention away from Europe in a way previous administrations haven't. So the US is far more focused on the Pacific, in particular North Asia and the Western Pacific, in a way that it hasn't been for a very long time. So the Chinese will be desperate to find ways to distract Europe and America elsewhere in the world, because as the Americans shift more of their forces, more of their investment, more of their intelligence collection, more of their economic power into the Pacific, it will become increasingly difficult for the Chinese to achieve their strategic objectives, which is to dominate the entirety of the Western part of the Pacific.
What about North Korea? It's also building its experience on the battlefield and pledging thousands more troops to the war effort for Putin. What kind of long-term regional implications do you think are being considered from where you are about their involvement in the war?
Yeah, I think the North Koreans, with the provision of munitions and troops, have had an impact on Putin's war against Ukraine, but the most profound impact is probably the exporting of North Korea's lessons in Ukraine and Russia back to the Korean Peninsula, where the North Koreans have 1 million troops. And if you have 1 million troops that improve in quality by 1 or 2%, with hundreds of thousands of drones, which the Russians are helping them to establish factories to build, that changes the correlation of forces on the Korean Peninsula. That's unhealthy, not just for the South Koreans and the Americans that are based there, but stability more generally in North Asia. So I think the biggest impact of North Korea's assistance to Russia will be in Korea and will be in the Western Pacific.
And how much nervousness is there from where you're speaking from in Australia about this?
Well, I think most people are more nervous about China. I mean, China is the big panda in the room. I mean, it's hard to discuss regional or global security without discussing China. But in some respects, it's very different to Europe. You have to deal with Russia. We have to deal with China, North Korea, and Russia, which also has a Pacific fleet and a Pacific presence. So there's a triumvirate in the Western Pacific. They work together. They conduct joint patrols. The Russians and Chinese do that. The Chinese clearly help the North Koreans. So in a contingency, for example, the Senkakus or Taiwan, it's very easy to imagine that the Russians might do something and the North Koreans might do something to split the focus of the Americans and its allies in the Western Pacific.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.